Hey everyone, this is James here from Italian Poliziotteschi and Jolly Reviews, bringing you another episode. Today I am doing a fun episode, for me at least, and I'm going to be talking about the Mount Rushmore, the top four Poliziotteschi directors, and canonize sort of highlight four different Poliziotteschi for each of them. So why do this? Well, it's mostly for fun. I did this episode already for Jolly. I had a lot of fun doing it. Mount Rushmore is kind of an interesting exercise because, we're talking about kind of canonizing sort of the big directors there. And for something like Jolly, I think it's pretty logical. I think it's largely already done. And in some ways, this one is the same. But the way that we tend to look at directors, it tends to be kind of like this pyramid. I think this is true definitely for Jolly and spaghetti westerns, where you kind of have like the big person for spaghetti westerns. That's Sergio Leone. For Jolly, that'd be Dario Argento. And then a lot of people have seen like the Dollars trilogy or a couple different Argento films, and then it kind of branches down and gets to like the next level. Jolly, that'd probably be the other three people, Fulci, Bava, and Martino. People will definitely argue about who should be included there, and I think there are definitely some people that will consider directors amongst that caliber to be even better. So there's definitely going to be a little bit of subjective preference there as well, and then it kind of gets lower and lower. Poliziotteschi is kind of interesting because the canon isn't necessarily as well established. I think I would argue that there's definitely kind of four big directors, but I think that can even be argued about a little bit. And I think it's hard to say who's kind of at top of that pyramid. There's not really a Dario Argento or Sergio Leone equivalent to kind of the genre overall. There are definitely some that are contending, but I don't know that there's someone that like sitting head and shoulders above that everyone has seen their films, or a lot of people have seen their films, and then like the next level down, it's significantly lower. In general, it's a genre that's not as well seen, and that's one of kind of the stated goals of this channel, is to kind of get more people to check out these different films, because I think they're really wonderful. I like them quite a bit. For me at least, Poliziotteschi and Jolly run kind of head and head as sort of like my favorite of the Italian genres. It's also an interesting contrast to something like slashers, where you can't really do this because people didn't go and make multiple slashers in the same way that these Italian genre directors were working. And, people know my opinion there. I will take kind of the Italian film industry above the slashers, definitely. Just because I think it's interesting to see these directors going back to the well and doing different ideas. You have someone like Sergio Martino, who in the heyday of the Jolly is doing like 5 Jolly in just like 2 or 3 years, and they're all kind of considered to be genre classics, and I think it's fun to see kind of like the different takes that he does there. I think they're all quite wonderful too. I reviewed them all over the course of kind of 2023, so definitely check those episodes out too. So yeah, there's definitely some also Rands here. I think people like Castellari's uncle Romolo Guerini, as well as Stelvio Massi. You could even toss in Enzo Castellari's dad, Marino Girolami, as well as sort of like people that could be mentioned because they have done multiple Poliziotteschi. I personally put them a bit below kind of the big directors here. I think the bench is a little bit weaker than it is for something like Jolly, where you have people like Aldo who did two very, very good, what I would consider Jolly, in my opinion, Short and Underclass Dolls and Who Saw or Die. Nonetheless, I think there are, there are four very clear choices here for directors here. So let's get into it a little bit. And really, really, a lot of these directors very, very concentrated on kind of the heyday of the Poliziotteschi, kind of there in the early to mid 70s. I think 3 of the 4 really went according to the times, so the Filone, whereas someone like Damiani, who I will mention later, kind of has a little bit of a bigger range of films. He was working in a little bit different climate, and I think he's the one director that might stand out a little bit as a contrast versus like the other 3 here, but we'll get into that too. Another interesting to think about too is how much shared DNA they have. In my opinion, all 4 of these guys are kind of distinct from each other. The range is pretty big when we're talking about someone from Damiani versus Umberto Lenzi. It's a little bit less about style than the Jolly genre is, just because it's a little bit less about style in general, the genre. But we still have these great settings. The Italian cities are used completely differently than they are for Giallo. So in Giallo, you have kind of like the inherited of like kind of like this Gothic genre where we have like big stylization of shadows and things like that. and people like Argento and Bava really established that their strengths as just visual storytellers. So a lot less about kind of the Agatha Christie stuff than you would think if you're kind of an outsider looking in. In here, the cities are kind of the playground where we're having like these incredible car chases. It's just a great backdrop for very gritty 70s stories. These stories are a little bit more working class. They all kind of use that same sort of big canvas of the cities to do it, but they all have kind of different things to say. Interesting thing, too, about all four of these guys is they have writing credits. They're all known as writers as well. Okay, so let's get into the big four, the Mount Rushmore. Okay, first up, I have Fernando de Leo, probably the least prolific director of these four, just in general. Very concentrated in the 1970s. He made around 10 of these or so. And he might be the most known, partially thanks to Tarantino, but I think he's also a tricky one to define. He's very clearly and openly influenced by American film noir, but is very, very much products of the time of the 1970s, so some of it is definitely like things taken from the headlines, which is true of a lot of these ones. There's kind of like an American current writing through all of these, where you can have someone like Fernando de Leo, who's starting American noir as sort of a big influence. Damiani has been described as the most American director, but I would say he's a little bit more American in maybe, I don't know, Sidney Lumet sort of sense. And Castellari is very openly influenced by American films and talks about that. And, you could draw side-by-side shots between something like The French Connection and High Crime, and you would definitely see some clear similarities and influences there in terms of them. So definitely all four of these guys pretty influenced by the American film industry in general. His career completely declined, kind of as the Italian industry declined in the late 70s and into the 80s. And De Leo, unlike these other guys, is not too much well-known beyond the Poliziotteschi. He had some spaghetti western writing credits and things like that. He directed One Jolly Slaughter Hotel, which is kind of fun. Not a great film necessarily, but interesting nonetheless if you're interested in that sort of thing. But very much kind of the director that perhaps, if you say Fernando de Leo, I'm going to automatically associate him with kind of this era of Italian crime films. Next up, I have Damiano Damiani. He worked in kind of the largest time range of these guys, 1968 to 1985. It says 1875, but obviously that's incorrect in my notes. And in my opinion, maybe the most unsung, perhaps because he's the least genre-y of all of them, even though I would argue his films definitely fall into the genre. Very literary, perhaps, in different ways, and he's doing different stuff. He has a lot of different social messaging. His films are definitely the ones that would be accessible to multiple crowds rather than just kind of the genre fans. And he feels a little bit more separate. His films aren't quite as in dialogue with the other ones as a couple of the other genre directors. I am a big fan of Damiani films. I do want to champion him as much as possible, and he has been getting a lot of love recently from Radiant Films, who has done a great job kind of releasing him. But if you look at that range, 1968 to 1985, he released a lot of films. There's about 10 of them in there. A lot of them set in Sicily, which gives them a little bit more of a different feel than the De Leo ones. A lot of those are set in northern Italy, with like Milan and that sort of those sorts of areas. So a very interesting contrast to the other ones. So Umberto Lenzi is next up, and he is definitely a guy that went with the times and directed different films on different genres. So obviously he made a lot of gialli, made a lot of Poliziotteschi. He would go on to make a lot of horror films. He would make some cannibal films. So really one of those guys that worked in all of the different genres. So very concentrated in a certain period is when he was doing the Poliziotteschi. He kind of moved over from gialli to there. Did Gang of War in Milan, did Almost Human, did a bunch more. He worked a lot with Tomas Milian. And I would say he's the most grindhouse of them. If I were to think of kind of Poliziotteschi films in general, I think Umberto Lenzi is definitely one that would come to mind. He had a lot of the traits of his Poliziotteschi are things that you would associate with Poliziotteschi overall. Very misanthropic, people just doing different terrible things in like the best possible way for someone like me to enjoy. There's a lot of nastiness there, and he does have, in my opinion, perhaps one of the biggest genre achievements of them, and that is Almost Human. So let's see. in terms of films I would like to highlight for them, I forgot to go over the other two, but Almost Human, Violent Naples, Game Worn Milan, and Cynic, The Rat and the Fist. I apologize. Swinging back to Fernando De Leo, the 4 films I would highlight for him are Caliber 9, Italian Connection, The Boss, and Kidnap Syndicate. 3 of those are kind of his milieu trilogy, which is kind of a loose thematic trilogy, very influenced by noir. And I think these are probably the films most people would know the most. I think all 3 are fantastic. I love The Boss, even though that's probably the weakest of them. And all 3 have very, very memorable things about them. You have Luca Canali in Italian Connection, which is, a great chase and just a great story in general. A little bit of a simpler film. You have maybe the best showcase for Henry Silva, just an iconic face here in The Boss. And Caliber 9 might be the best of them, and maybe one of the best Poliziotteschi's, maybe even the best one, period. So really, really phenomenal films. And Kidnap Syndicate, which is kind of his high and low. I really like this film too. I think it combines kind of some interesting social messaging. Kidnapping was certainly a big issue in Italy at the time with those. With Damiani, I have Confessions of a Police Captain, his take on sort of the Sicily and a lot of the corruption going on there. He worked a lot in Sicily, as I was talking about. Cases Closed, Forget It, a great prison drama. I think this is a really wonderful contrast to a lot of the other films. There wasn't a ton of prison dramas going on at the time. Really interesting use of Franco Nero in both of these films. Very, very young Franco Nero uses him very differently than other directors would. I Am Afraid, this is probably my favorite of the Damiani films. Very, very well done paranoid thriller with Gian Maria Vogliante. And Goodbye and Amen, I'm just a big fan of this film. I know some people aren't the hugest fans of this one, but I like it quite a bit. It's just a very nice, taut thriller. Damiani didn't think so highly of it, but I think it's very good. For the Lindsay ones, Almost Human is just a great kind of grindhouse film. Completely, I think it's a very, very affecting, one of those memorable films you're just not going to forget very easily, thanks to the fantastic Tomas Milian performance, one of the most impactful performances of the genre, period. Violent Naples is just kind of a crazy romp through the city. You have John Saxon, you have Maurizio Merli, probably my favorite Merli flick. You have Game Worn Milan. This one's Antonio Sabato. Maybe the most jolly as well as noirish of the films. I think it's a pretty well-rounded film. I know some people are not huge fans of Sabato, but I think he's pretty good in this film. I like that he's always bringing the energy. Not a very subtle actor, but I think he works pretty well in the genre. And The Cynic, The Rat and the Fist. This one kind of takes that Leone 3 leads sort of style, and you have Merli, Saxon, and Milian. And those are just 3 great genre stalwarts. I think it's a little bit weaker film than the other 3, but I still like it quite a bit nonetheless. Okay, and last up, I have Enzo Castellari. So he directed the least of them. He did 5, and in my opinion, he's probably the best action director of the bunch. He's very, very action-centric. He did the least, but I think his mark is felt perhaps more than... his mark is definitely felt on the genre. Of these 4 directors, the only one that really had a film that kind of signified the start of the genre is Castellari in High Crime. The films often credited there are High Crime, Marcino's Violent Professionals, as well as Steno's Execution Squad. So Enzo Castellari helped to really kickstart the genre. That film very influenced by French Connection, great use of locations and things like that in the Mediterranean, Genoa, which is a different location than I think he liked to use that location a little bit more than some of the other directors did. And he's definitely one of the most fun directors, one that I can definitely fire up. I'm in the mood for more often. His social commentary is a little more hit or miss than someone like Damiani, but I think in something like Street Law, it does work pretty well. And I think, in my opinion, he has kind of just the best pure action and pure fun of all of these guys. So definitely one guy I can fire up his films and have a good time, even if, I've seen them a few times. So my favorite of his is The Big Racket. Strongly recommend that film. Maybe the best action film of the Poliziotteschi's, and very different from something that's also action-centric by someone like De Leo, Italian Connection. High Crime, really signature film, helped kick off the genre. Heroin Busters, pure action fun, very simple story, a little bit thin on those things, but you have a great action star in Fabio Testi, as well as a fun David Hemmings with a Goblin score in the era where they're doing Suspiria, Dawn of the Dead, and Deep Red. Amazing. And you have Street Law, which I think is actually a surprisingly impactful social commentary. I know this one was a little bit controversial at the time because it's a vigilante film, but I think Nero is excellent in it, and I think Castellari has some great visuals and memorable visuals there. Okay, so that concludes this film, where this episode where we're talking about the four, in my opinion, the four kind of signature Poliziotteschi directors, as well as 4 films from each. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Let me know how you like this episode, and I will see y'all next time.